Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Melanin Margin, the weekly chat show where conversations about race are never off the table. We're your hosts, Quaviondre Williams.
And Daquon Wilson.
So let's get into this week's conversation. What's hot on the table this week?
So, in an article, The Problem with Euphoria, written by Samuel Getchu, he states that, quote, social media was central to the unfurling of the tragic sagas of his peers in high schools by inundating their peers' Instagram feeds with photos of red cups, bags of bud, hot box cars, all of the indicators of a so called real coming of age. Notoriety and popularity were the same thing. The appeal of these acts lay in the public proof of participation. They had sex so their peers would know they had sex. They did drugs so their peers would know they did drugs. They were motivated by the petrifying prospect of being left behind, of growing up too slowly, of making it to its inaccurate but horrifyingly on target. He states that it aestheticizes the traumas it depicts, and this generation may be particularly vulnerable to it. He states that while it may have been intended to serve as a warning, Euphoria often feels more like an instructional tutorial or a roadmap, one that sensationalizes its subject matter while neglecting to fully disclose its risk and hazard. So, do you think that Euphoria sensationalizes drugs and sex, or just spotlights it as a real part of high school society?
So first and foremost, I think we need to stop blaming the media because a parent doesn't know how to raise their kids. Um,
Say that again.
like we really need to stop because whether or not Euphoria sensationalizes drugs and sex shouldn't matter because as a parent you should know what your child is up to and hope that you raise them well enough with enough discernment and self-confidence not to be drawn into those crowds. And I'm not gonna lie, when I first heard about Euphoria and like saw the clips of it circulating on TikTok and social media, I was appalled by how blatant these displays of sex and drug use were. I mean, the first episode that I actually saw was the first, with that 13-year-old kid with the face full of tattoos selling fucking drugs. So trust me, a bitch was fucking shook. But once I calmed down from like my initial reaction, which was just how inaccurate I believe Euphoria was, I realized something. Euphoria really does reflect a particular high school experience that if you don't run in those circles, you wouldn't be aware of.
Right.
When I reflected on my high school specifically, I remember overhearing conversations about people having sex at school, having full on cocaine parties with their friends, leaking other students' sex tapes, and all sorts of crazy shit. And even in middle school, around the same age as Ashtray was on the show, I heard about kids at my school selling weed or getting drunk. I mean, I think the only inaccurate thing about Euphoria is how the students aren't dress coded for the outfits they wear. That to me is the only real. But, to answer the question, yes, I do think that it sensationalizes drugs and sex, but not any more than actual high school students do. The fact that Euphoria sensationalizes drugs and sex is precisely why I think, from the only one of the episodes I've seen, I think that it's so accurate to the high school experience because the show is filmed through the creative lens of someone actually experiencing high school. Sex and drugs for for some teenagers are a marker for like coolness and something to aspire to. I mean, Daquon, you've actually watched the show all the way through, so I want to know what your thoughts on this question is.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think that sure it sensationalizes it a bit, but I also think that it's a really real representation of certain circles of high school.
Yeah.
Like I was in middle school and knew people who were pregnant. I knew people who had sex in middle school. I knew people
Yeah.
who had sex on campus in high school. I've had people who've leaked sex tapes between people and like all of this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So when I saw that reflected in Euphoria, it wasn't something surprising to me.
Yeah.
And I also think that there are situations where that kind of commentary is put into the show of just like, for example, the character of Kat, who it was like, oh, you haven't had sex yet? What are you doing? And so
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that was a milestone for her to be like, I've had sex.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that while there could be this sensationalize of, drugs and sex, I don't think that it's any more than is creating more educational curriculum in schools, really teaching parents, giving them the materials to have these conversations with their children. So, like creating all of these different things outside of movies and TV. So, it's not movies and TVs raising the child, it's parents and educators teaching them how to be a person.
Exactly. I also want to ask you, like, do you even think that Euphoria is a show geared towards teenagers or adults who've endured that specific aspect of high school?
Here's the thing. If you are a teenager watching Euphoria, what are you doing? You have
What are you
homework to
doing?
do. Go do your algebra homework. You gotta turn it in tomorrow. Like go do like don't watch Euphoria. I think that Euphoria is very much Degrassi for adults. Like Degrassi, I see is that high school kind of for teenagers. A lot of the
Yeah.
cast are actually teenagers, and so I feel like that's a show for actual teenagers. But Euphoria, it's so much for adults. I think that
Yeah.
even just like in some of its referencing of certain pop cultural moments or anything like that, or just like how deep it gets into like people are psychoanalyzing literal eyeliner and glitter and stuff like that and how it's used on people's faces. I don't think a teenager is getting that deep into it. So when you
Yeah.
have these references built into a show, I think that that kind of shows that it's leaning to a more adult audience, a more nuanced audience that are going to think a little bit deeper than just like, oh, this is a cool show. Let me watch drugs and sex.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that this is not a show for actual children or teenagers. I think this is a show for adults ages 21 and up as a sort of reflection.
Especially with all the full frontage
Yeah.
nudity in it.
But yeah, I think it really is a reflection of the crazy shit that happens in high school and like, how some of the people in high school have gotten involved in, with that kind of stuff or heard about it. And um let's just be real. We know that teenagers are watching this show because teenagers will always watch things they're not supposed to do. We know
Right.
that. However, I do think that this goes back to what I said earlier about how parents should trust the way they raise their child. While it's
Hmm.
true that this show could influence some teenagers to want to try drugs or have sex, it's not any more influential than classmates who are trying to get them to do the same fucking thing. Um, my mom raised my sister and me with a certain set of values that even when we weren't in her presence, we still upheld those same values. As a teenager, my mom told me not to watch certain things, and a bitch still fucking did because I was a fucking teenager. And I was like, oh, I wonder what this is. Why can't I watch it? You know what I mean? And I remember watching several TV shows and movies with some very explicit sex scenes and drug use and violence, but I've never wanted to emulate the people I saw on screen because I chose not to, because of how I was raised, the type of person I was, and the life experience I had at that point. Now, this isn't to judge people who have engaged in those activities because you never know what someone has gone through, that has put them in a position where they felt the need to do drugs or engage in dangerous sexual behavior or have to be violent because, bad shit happens and some teens are really dealt a very bad deck in life.
Right.
But the point is, if a teen is going to do something, they're going to do it regardless of what they see on TV or what you say as a parent. Um, all that you can do as a parent is try your best to create a safe and healthy environment for your child to prosper in, and hope that they don't get involved with the wrong crowd. Because at the end of the day, they aren't just teenagers. They are people with their own lives, their own thoughts and feelings. And no matter how tightly you want to, oh, baby, don't do this and don't do that, eventually you're going to have to let them make their own choices. I mean, what do you think, Daquon?
I think that we have to recognize that this is an art. And so when you are a creative person who creates art and somebody that's not in your intended audience sees that art and gets offended or whatever like that, that is not your problem as an artist, unless you're doing something like really problematic. Like, that's not your problem. So if Sam Levinson wrote Euphoria and he wrote it for a more mature crowd and there are teenagers watching it, that was not Sam Levinson's intended audience.
Exactly.
Especially if he is then not marketing it towards teenagers, because I think that's where the problems happen, is even if you write it for adults but then market it towards teenagers, that can be problematic. But to my knowledge, Euphoria is not really marketed towards teenagers. And so I feel like an artist should be able to make their art without having to worry about people who aren't their intended audience, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think, and like, again, I think that goes back to that parent trusting the way they raise their child, because at the end of the day, when we look, I mean, I think I remember this video. I don't know if we talked about this on the podcast before, but Cardi B was under fire one time when she was playing her music. She was playing WAP, right? And her kid had walked into the room. She's like, oh, no, 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 no. And she turned the music off. And she just sat down and was like, hey, baby, you know, talking to her baby, and then waited for her baby to leave the room while she was on live stream before she turned the music back on. And she waited for her child to leave the room. And all of the people in the comments were like, oh, so your kid can't listen to your music, but our kids can. And it's just like, no one is looking at the fact that that is some A1 fucking parenting. Because Cardi B knows that her music is not for children. She knows that her music is not for teenagers. Again, teenagers are going to teenager, but the reality is her market has always been adults. She didn't come into the scene like JoJo Siwa and then suddenly been like, throw this pussy back in my ass. Like, none of, like, touch a dangly thing in the back of my throat. Like, she didn't come onto, you know what I mean? Like, that wasn't the original message that she was trying to send with her music. That was not the original audience she was trying to reach out to. So the fact that people are trying to blame the artist for who intakes their art is a problem. It's a fucking problem. And people need to grow the fuck up. Like, honestly. Raise your fucking kids and stop letting these artists raise your fucking kids.
There are parental controls for a reason. It's your responsibility to use them. If you're too incompetent, that is your problem.
Motherfucking purr.